The only tools we have to observe the outside world are our senses, either through their direct use or through tools that inform us of what may exist outside our sensory perceptions. Just because something can't be seen does not mean it doesn't exist, and just because you believe you see something does not mean it exists either. Our senses operate in a routine fashion. Our eyes, ears, skin, and other sensory organs detect a stimulus, relay that information into the brain's thalamus, and that information is directed into the respective part of the brain which processes the information. The only exception to this is the nose, whose route takes it past the prefrontal cortex before entering the thalamus, and that might indicate why it's linked to memory so strongly. But since people don't often smell miracles, I'll be skipping by that exception. The areas of the brain which process various types of sensory input are often close to similar areas which comprehend raw sensory information. For example, incoming visual input in the occipital lobe is near where visual association information is processed. So when we observe something, that activity in the occipital lobe also activates visual associations to help us understand what we're seeing. Occasionally you might hear stories of someone reporting seeing the Virgin Mary or some other religious figure in clouds, paint splattered against a wall, or even a piece of toast. This isn't really a divine intervention, but rather a revelation of a strong bias towards seeking patterns, in that particular case a face. Not only do our minds seek patterns, but we're much more likely to seek patterns we're already familiar with. Gestalt processing is commonly used by our brains to organize a large number of things into a more sensible whole. When you look at a few colorful dots moving along randomly, you unconsciously find ways to group them together through their colors or similar motions. These associations are technically arbitrary, as dots on your monitor have no real relationship, but noticing similar qualities helps us relate one to the other and create a group that would otherwise not exist. This is a means of alleviating stress on the brain and essentially reduces the burden on our mind's limited resources. Imagine how difficult it would be to take the time to understand each and every little dot for its intrinsic worth as opposed to just placing it in a group, which is much more easily managed. These mental shortcuts, or heuristics, are used in many different ways by our brains to quickly understand the world around us. They're very valuable skills, but they can also cause some problems. Finding a few salient qualities of a group, imagined or not, creates stereotyping, an obvious route to prejudice. This is not always a bad thing. It makes sense to think of something that is called candy will probably be sweet and delicious, but there are times when this can backfire on us, and our preconceptions color our perceptions. I personally wouldn't consider black licorice as sweet or delicious, as candy in general certainly is, but nonetheless I've been assured that it is candy. So maybe my idea of what candy is too narrowly defined, or maybe I'm including something in that candy grouping I shouldn't. Of course, this is a demon I'll continue to struggle with in private. What happens when we see something ambiguous, though? A face on a piece of toast, for instance. The human brain has a huge bias towards perceiving faces, and a large amount of our brain power is used to process this facial information. With a few muscular twitches, a face can show us happiness or sadness in an instant, and we can quickly recognize these subtle traits because of the added strength our brains place in processing that information. This bias is well served when talking to other people, but this has made us susceptible to seeing faces everywhere, clouds, in food, and even on Mars. Our senses are easily fooled into seeing the familiar. What we're actively doing is grouping ambiguous sensory data and unconsciously using heuristics to fit it into our model of how we understand the world around us. It's no surprise holy visions happen to the most religious of people, or in the most religious of societies, because through frequent exposure they have a bias for grouping things in a divine context, and they are constantly primed to see those patterns. Someone who goes to church every week and sees a statue of the Virgin Mary is more likely to see that same image in their toast. So the instantaneous reaction of seeing that holy figure may seem a bit odd to a more secular person, but these reactions are coming from someone who is more likely to match an ambiguous image to a familiar group. The same can be said about hearing odd tones as a mysterious voice reading scripture, or warmth being construed as the warmth of God. When you're primed to see the divine everywhere, your brain will likely go along with that suggestion, and explain what you sense in the terms you expect. However, it's important to remember that this is not a conscious deception. Heuristics are rules of thumb created over a lifetime of experiences, and they can affect your perceptions in a variety of ways. This is simply an outline to explain how a potentially rational person might see faces in their breakfast. Imagine a child in a dark room, frightened and convinced the boogeyman is lying in the shadows. Now imagine that same child in a dark movie theater, surrounded by other people waiting for a movie to start. Assuming you aren't being bombarded by commercials, the dark won't be quite as scary in this case, and the child will be a lot less likely to confuse shadows in the room for monsters. You can brush off the first example as a child's imagination getting the best of them, and that's certainly the case, but why is it a child asserting what they see less valid than an adult? Are children just less capable of using their eyes? Or are we less likely to acknowledge that the sensory experiences of adults are just as susceptible to emotional manipulation? Now imagine the final darkness moving towards you, death itself, and all the emotions that would conjure up. By definition, a near-death experience would have no observations of the death experience itself, but people report perceiving all manner of sights or sounds. Although my earlier example of a child in a darkened room seems like a harsh comparison, the parallel seems rather apt. When under extreme emotional duress, our emotions color our perceptions. Fear is a very powerful motivator, and fear of the unknown can tint ambiguous stimuli such as brain trauma, causing you to see spots or hear a ringing in your ears. Couple that with the effect of priming, suggesting the usual vision of a tunnel of light with a choir singing is what you should be expecting at death, and the result of near-death experiences being produced so uniformly seems less supernatural. So our senses are not always to be implicitly trusted. Emotions and expectations alter how we see the world. So when someone reports a sensory experience that is very real to them, always remain skeptical and ask if maybe the easiest explanation isn't that they're talking to a deity, but just the voices imagined in their head.